Good afternoon. Thanks for having me here. On behalf of our State Aviation Officer, Lieutenant Colonel Barkus, my name is Jason Garr. I'm the Chief Instructor Pilot for the Kansas Army National Guard. I've been on a few fires, and I've been flying helicopters for a long time. So what I would like to do is encourage an open discussion. Informal briefing, stop me at any time. I'll be happy to, have a discussion about anything you guys have a question about. I am very meticulous and very detailed. My daughters will attest to that. So if there's anything I don't have in my slides, you want to know more information, please, by all means. So overall, what I want to do is give an understanding of what our capabilities are, response times, and how to facilitate us so that we're effective for you in fighting fires. So what we can bring to the fight is a very agile resource that can get to those inaccessible areas like we've been discussing. So you're going to find a lot of simulation between Rodney's brief and this one because aviation kind of works the same regardless. So the first thing we have to think about is where we're at and how quickly can we get there. So the two things we have to think about in this avenue, are we at work or are we at home mowing the yard? If we're at home mowing the yard, it's obviously going to take us much longer to get to where we can respond with our aircraft. So I'm a type A personality. You're going to see a lot of pictures of me in the presentation there. So for non-duty, and for us, this is Saturday through Monday for the most part. What we're looking at, best case scenario, is about 6 hours. And that's 6 hours when I'm leaving my place of work with the aircraft headed to the fire. Because what we'll have to do is recall folks, we'll find the folks that we can recall, get them back in, get everything ready, and then get the aircraft ready and the equipment ready and get it out the door. If we're already at work, we can reduce that to about 3 hours. And if we have a heads up, and Jonathan and I have already talked, if we have a heads up and we kind of know about this the day before and there's a potential for something to go on, and we're just having a sidebar up here in the front, if we're notified of a potential, we can probably get the aircraft off the ground in less than an hour. So it's not pre-staging, it's pre-setting, let's call it that. And it doesn't cost anything for us to get our equipment out, get our folks ready and notified, just so we can react quicker. Once we leave the flight facilities, we have one in Topeka and one in Salina. Both facilities have about the same number of buckets. I'll get to that in a minute. But once we leave either one of those places, however far away your fire is, at 120 miles an hour, that's how quick we'll get there. Once we get there, depending upon the distance again, if it's relatively close to Salina or Topeka, we may be able to go action the fire immediately for the duration of that tank of fuel. Otherwise, we're going to need to sit down, refuel, and deploy the bucket and get it ready to go. That's going to take about 45 minutes once we get to the location. So then looking at after we actually arrive, about 1 hour is when we're going to drop our first bucket. So let's say it's a day off, 6 to 8 hours to get us off the ramp. It's a 2-hour flight to your location. That's 10 hours. And then an hour after that, it's 11 hours for us to respond. That's the reality of it. And in all, by the time we get unless you notify us at 5 in the morning, we're probably not going to fight fires the first day. And that's been proven in the last several months. All right, so we're going to fight your fire with the UH-60 Blackhawk. We have Mike models, and we have Alpha Lima models. Now, the reason I'm giving you that detail is because we have different capabilities with each one of those versions. The UH-60 Mike model are newer aircraft, have a heavier payload to some degree, more capability really is the engines. We are restricted to day operations. We cannot fight fires at night. Our crew duty day is typically 14 hours. That's when we show up to work, when we leave work. That can be extended to 16 and quite often will. And if required, we can get a higher approval and go beyond 16, but probably not more than 18, depending on the situation. The maximum flight time that we can put on the aircraft every day, it's really the air crew, is 8 hours per aircraft. As far as the weather and visibility, we talked about the weather. When it comes to the winds, we can fly in winds up to 45 miles an hour. That's about 45 knots. It's about 52 miles an hour. And that's an aircraft limitation. We can't start the aircraft if the wind's above that because of the rotor blades. Beyond that, we have to have ceilings, or the cloud level has to be a certain height off the ground for us to fly legally. Now, as a rotary wing asset, we can fly in much worse weather than the airplanes can typically, because we don't necessarily need to fly fast, and we don't need long places to land. So we can usually fly with ceilings of 1,000 feet off the ground and visibility of 3 miles. If it's that or above, it's a real easy solution. If it's below that, then we'll have to jump through some hoops and get some approvals to fly anything less than that. I will tell you that probably 70% of the rescues in Houston and in the surrounding area were done in weather less than 1,003. So we have the capability, it's just not ideal, especially when you have a lot of smoke involved, because you got visibility decreasing at the ground and visibility decreasing up above us. It gives us a very narrow window to operate. All right. So the other thing is we also have the capability to provide what we call CASEVAC. Now, basically, that's a life, limb, or eyesight situation. And I wanted to throw this in here, and it'll be in a different slide as well, because if we have one of those extreme situations, we can assist and provide immediate extraction by landing, unloading the injured personnel, and get them back to probably a predetermined location, so they can get ambulance support, especially if we're fighting fires like in Clark County out in the middle of nowhere. All right. Typically, each aircraft has an on-station time of about 2 hours. It's about how much fuel we can sustain on the fire. So that's going to become important when we start talking about how close the water has to be. With a bucket deployed, we can fly at about 70 miles an hour. So again, I'll have some details on that in just a minute. All right, so the big question that I was asked to talk about was communication. How can we talk to the folks on the ground? So with a little research and talking with Stephen West, we did discover, and we're going to do some testing. We tried to do it this week, and we didn't get to it because of my schedule, but we are capable of using these national VTAC frequencies with the UH-60 mic model. That aircraft has different radio capabilities that allow us to get into these ranges with frequencies. So we can do VTAC, UTAC with the UH-60 mic. Now, if we're using the aircraft with the red crosses on them, the Alpha Lima models, most of those aircraft are fitted with the 800 Technosonic radio, and we can go onto the trunking system. And we have tested and used that in the past. Our radios were programmed probably 8 or 10 years ago with the system, and a lot of that's still active today. One of the takeaways from preparing this briefing is that we may want to update our fills in those radios to match the changes over the last few years. So we have that capability on a limited number of aircraft. Any questions so far? Thoughts, ideas? All right, so Our other capability is obviously the way that we're going to dump water on your fire. Last week we received an additional order of buckets that we've been trying to get for years. So now, excuse me, so now in the state we have the capability to use 9 buckets. A few details on that. We have 3 different types of buckets really in the state. We have 2 of them that are really old, over 15 years old. They're what we call a sock bucket, and it's a one-shot release. It's going to dump 660 gallons all at once. Now, it dumps it through a sock, so it's going to give us a little bit longer of a streamline, and that's going to assist better in the grass fires because it doesn't dump it into a big round spot. It dumps it into a long linear trail, which can be beneficial. The other buckets we have are called the Bambi Max. And the Bambi Max has a large 20-inch valve in the bottom of the 600-gallon bucket, and it's electronically operated. And that allows us to do multiple dumps with this 600 gallons. So I can dump however much. We usually go about half a bucket at each dump, and gives us the opportunity to to hit 2 spots on the fire with 1 trip to the pond. So those are, and we can also we're working out some techniques to sustain the release of the water to get a nice long linear line like the sock bucket as well, because we found that's beneficial. So we can, with this, using the flight techniques and the drop techniques of the bucket, we can vary the way that we deliver water. And what's important about this is nobody knows better than your teams on the ground what they need on the fire. So we'll talk about some specific ones. One of the things that we also purchased was what's called a long line. As you can see, it's a 100-foot cable that we can suspend the bucket on. Now what this does is that gives us an opportunity to stay farther away from the fire, because one of the big problems that we bring to the fire is rotor wash. So if we suspend 6,000 pounds of water underneath our aircraft, as that aircraft's hovering at about that height, we're pushing out about 80-mile-an-hour winds underneath the aircraft, which is detrimental to a fire. Seen it firsthand. So the long line is going to give us the benefit of staying higher above the fire and reducing that dramatically. We already talked about the multi-dump capability. All right, so our drop techniques, probably the one that is going to be mostly used is what I've been discussing, the line technique, which is going to be a sustained linear drop of the full bucket to give us the longest linear distance. This is a pretty good shot of a good altitude that we try to use. It's maybe a little high, and of course the benefit of using the long line, this is the short line here, that's about 30 feet below the aircraft, is that I can get the bucket a lot closer to the top of the trees without inducing that rotor wash. The other is what we call an area drop, and this is where we slow our airspeed down, and that gives us a shorter, wider dispense of the water, but yet it's still linear. And then finally, we can do what we call a spot drop, and that's where we actually come to almost a complete stop over the top of the fire and dump all 660 gallons in a relatively small area. The problem with spot drops is that our rotor wash almost invariably induces into the fire. So we have to try to do those at higher elevations. One of the things that we got to train on a little bit out in Clark County, there was a fire burning inside of a basement, and the structure was gone, and there was just a basement with some stuff burning in the bottom, and we experimented a little bit with altitude and realized that we had to be really high before we started stirring up the ashes. So spot drops are rather difficult. They work best on structures like we've got illustrated here. Not so good on the prairie. All right, I got a little video. You guys might have seen this before, but there's some really good illustrations in here about how it all works. There's no video or no audio. Here's a nice linear drop that you can see, and that's one of our 660-gallon buckets. We're going to talk a little bit about our sustainment and our logistics in just a minute. He's talking about how awesome you guys are. That's our natural position in life, is relaxed. So I apologize about the sound. We weren't sure about that, but you got to see a little bit about what it looks like from our perspective anyway. So one of the things that first and foremost in Army aviation is safety. It really drives what we do 24/7. So the first thing, and it's already been alluded to, is the weight of the water. It's almost 6,000 pounds of weight. And as you can see, it drops out of the bucket pretty rapidly. So one of the things that we have to do is have the ground crew in sight before we release the water. Either the pilots have to see them, or our crew chiefs in the back, which actually they're the guys with the finger on the trigger. They have to see those guys before we release the water and make sure they're clear. So if you think about it, that's about the weight of a car, right? So yeah, there's no badge of honor. There might be a hospital bill, no badge. So what we're saying is a minimum safe distance of 100 feet. Now, where did this come from? This came from, right here. We can look at this. We can practice this. I've got a slide that talks a little bit about training down the road, where I want to reach out and discover what the best solution is, because this right here is an educated guess. Air-to-ground radio, we've sort of already covered that. Our best solution, best case scenario, is that we can talk to the team that's on the ground, on the fire where the water's being dumped. That's the best case scenario. At Clark County, we did get that to work. The second thing is we always have a backup communication plan, because Army aviators like to talk a lot. So what we want to try to do is develop some visual signals. If we lose voice communications, we can use visual signals so that we can still release the water on the fire. So again, that's something that I think that needs developed so that we do something that's easy for you, yet is something that we can see and identify very easily from the air. So that's probably going to involve some hand-arm signals. We know when we do a bad job, those signals are usually pretty clear. So the thing about mixing with the fixed wing, and we did practice this down at the Hutch fire, the air-to-air, we did have air-to-air communication, and that worked out really well, and we need to probably, moving forward, capture and identify through state frequency managers some frequencies that we can use that are just strictly for the aircraft to talk to each other. We were using some generic civilian frequencies that basically are just open. So anybody could have got in there and got in our way. So that's something we probably need to look into. The other thing is that what if the aircraft can't talk to each other? Every airport has the same kind of landing pattern. So whether your radio works or not, you can enter the pattern and land your aircraft safely and not run into anybody else. That's called a procedural separation. I think we should also develop a procedural separation over the fires, developing a traffic flow and sequencing and separation, because inevitably radios and communication are going to not work. It just happens. And we still need to fight the fire, and we need to do it safely. You don't fly without fuel and mechanics and food and all that. So we'll jump into that a little bit. The purpose of this is so to gain an understanding about the logistics train that does come with Army helicopters, because it is significant. The first one is fuel. Ultimately, we're going to see throughout the next few slides that we really prefer to be at airports because they're already set up for aviation operations in almost every way possible. It gives us a safe place to land. We don't have to get landowner approval. We don't have to do any safety surveys of the land and things of that nature. The maintenance side of it, a lot for the same reason. It gives us typically a good place. We'd much rather do maintenance over concrete than we do over grass. But I will tell you that, you know, we're the United States Army and we can do our job anywhere. We just like to take it easy if we can. All right, so water. This is another logistic thing that we really have to think about, and it's very complicated. And I think, John, I'm going to reserve some of it for Jonathan because he's got some insight on his side that's way out of my scope. But the thing that we're going to look at, though, is when we go to a dip site, we're going to ask the question, is there pre-approval to get this water? That's to help protect us and to help protect you. And, you know, getting shot at by farmers is not really something we want to practice. So that pre-approval. The second thing is we need to deal with the zebra mussel issue. We have a couple contingency things that we can deal with. Basically, once we dip a bucket, it's either got to dry completely or get a bleach wash before we go to another dip site. And once it gets warmer, we're going to see exactly how long it takes us to bleach a bucket. I'm guessing about 20 minutes with the bleach solution. So that's something that we have to consider because that can certainly slow us down with our response to a quickly moving fire. All right, the next thing is our maximum distance to water. So before I said that we can fly with the bucket deployed about 70 miles an hour. So we're looking to be effective, we need to be about 7 miles or less from a dip site. So if we think about that, an aircraft has 2 hours of hang time over the fire doing its operation. In that 2 hours, if I'm 7 miles away, I'm going to get about 8 buckets in those 2 hours. Okay. If I'm 3 miles away, I'm going to get about 12 buckets. That's an extra 2,600 gallons on the fire. So you can see very quickly that just keeping the water source close is really important. But we'll get water wherever we're approved. Final deal on that. Let's see. All right, so what is a good water source? So what we'd like to see is 7 foot or deeper. That can be a challenge. Out in Clark County, it's a challenge. We dipped at the reservoir. If you're familiar with it, there's like 2 places to get water in Clark County. We got permission to attempt dipping out of a few catch ponds, farm ponds. Some of them were 3 to 4 feet deep, and it's just not very effective. We get a lot of mud and about half a bucket load. So the key thing is that about 7 feet. The other thing is we need to make sure there's no obstacles in the water. Submerged branches and things of that nature will take a bucket out of the fight really quickly, and then we lost that asset. And then we like to have no obstacles within 150 feet of the 7 foot of water, wherever that would be in the water source. A couple ideas with this. When we were in Clark County, they actually dug a hole in the river for us to go down and dip in. Because if you're familiar with the river out there, it's low, it's sandy, it's not very deep in any one spot. So they dug a hole in the middle of the river so it would fill with water as with the natural flow, and then we could actually get the bucket to submerge in that shallow water source. The issue was they piled all the dirt in one spot. So if we could not pile the dirt in one spot, that'll make it even better for us, especially if we're not using the long line. With the shorter deal, that's hard. The dirt got in the way. Possible other water sources. would be swimming pools, the municipal swimming pool. The issue there is, I was talking about the 80-mile-an-hour winds we produce. That can wreak havoc on some of the deck chairs and things of that nature. So we're going to have some pre-coordination and some liability stuff kind of established before we go into a public swimming pool. We also talked about possibly filling it with a pumper truck. So a question for the crowd in general: how long would it take for a truck to fill 660 gallons? 5 minutes? 10 minutes?
500 gallon a minute pump.
Are you talking about in
Okay.
hover? Like you guys come in a hover?
So potentially what we would try, so this valve on the bottom of the bucket gives it a nice base where we can maybe get it to stand up on end. Most of the time it wants to lay outside. So we're either going to pick it up and stand it on end and put a hose over the edge and fill it up as a possibility. That's just a concept. We'd have to kind of do a proof. So we would land, especially with the long line, we can get the aircraft, 30, 40 feet away from the bucket at that point. You can drive up to the bucket with the truck, fill it up, and then drive off. That's kind of the concept I'm playing with in my head. So if anybody wants to experiment, see me later. All right, as with everything else, we can sleep in tents. We don't like to sleep in tents. Transportation, we have a lot of gear that we need to use it or work at night. So we do tend to need larger vehicles to get ourselves to and from wherever the aircraft are to wherever we're bedded down for the night. So a lot of these things I know are hard for us to facilitate and can sometimes be facilitated by the on-scene team. All right, so finally we'll look into training. This is actually a photo from when one of our aircraft was in California fighting fires a few years back. And they're distributing supplies to some of the fire teams that were out on the ground. There's a lot of things that we're capable of, and I think a few good concepts came up in some of the other discussions, and I want to kind of expand on those a little bit as well. I think what would benefit us quite a bit is if we could practice communications, because like I said, often that's the hardest thing to get past. We can try those pre-planned channels and try some communications, comm checks. The other thing is, how confident are your teams in being able to tell a helicopter where the fire's at? That's kind of a unique skill. Now, the great thing of it is, we happen to work with a bunch of folks that do that for a living. So we can take some of the concepts that they have, develop a little bit of a procedure, share that with you, do some training, and very quickly get your teams the capabilities or the tricks to telling a helicopter where the fire's at. We're going to call that a talk-on. So proof of concept, training opportunities that are out there. Obviously, we can transport folks and equipment, but what does that look like? In the past, I've transported emergency responders with their dogs. We've looked at transporting high-tech equipment and how it would be packaged to fit in the aircraft along with the team. If we need to displace some firemen into fire lines in different ways, what equipment would they have with them? Where would it fit on the aircraft? That kind of concept. Along with that, the whole concept of being able to see what's going on from the sky. It seemed like there was a lot of hesitancy to ask us for a ride. When we're under the command of the governor on state active duty, that is easier than ever. So there are a few steps we have to go through, but it's easiest at that point. So we can do the spotter, We can take the helicopter manager. We can take chiefs, whatever you guys need. We can also commit, if you guys are having, let's say, some long-range communication issues, we also may be able to provide some possibility as retrans from the aerial platform. All right, so one of the techniques that we use in the military quite a bit is called a 9-line. Now, most of us associate that with some kind of medevac response, right? If we ever watched the History Channel. But a 9-line is just a pre-coordinated set of instructions. And what I'd like to propose is that we develop this 9-line. So when I say line 3, everybody in this room knows line 3 is the location of the fire. Line 1 is the call sign of who's fighting the fire. Line 2 is what type of aid you're requesting. Bambi bucket, right? That's a 9-line. So if we could come up with some kind of standardized 9-line and put it into this response cell and get it out to all the teams, we can very quickly brief a refreshed air crew onto a fire and not have to spend a lot of time going to the TOC or the JOC or the EOC and getting the crews briefed up. They can actually do it en route to the fire. Let's see, we already talked about no commo contingencies. And then lastly, I want to expound a little bit on emergency contingencies. Whether it's civilians, the firefighting teams, or maybe an aircraft's in trouble, I think that we should probably come up with some considerations with emergency responses and how to deal with that kind of situation. If we're capable of assisting folks on the ground by getting transportation from these remote fires to back to hospitals or wherever, or an ambulance, we want to be able to do that. Likewise, I want you to be able to take care of me if I have issues. So again, I just think that's something that we probably need to think about and talk about. All right. So, detailed oriented, was I off or on? It's a lot of stuff. I apologize for that, but I didn't want to waste the opportunity to share some of these ideas with you. So with that, I'll take any questions.
Before we take questions, this is Jonathan with Kansas Division of Emergency Management, for those of you who can't see me on the phone. Chief Garr talked about a lot of things, and one of the things that I stressed this morning in my presentation was the importance of that notification from the fire chief or fire department to the county emergency manager to state emergency management as soon as you know there's a problem. And this is why it becomes critical. It's because of the deployment time after we notify the National Guard Joint Operations Center and they reach out to the aviation units to give them a heads up or to place them on some type of standby because there's a heightened fire danger or critical fire danger for that day or an extended period of days back to back. So getting that information to us sooner makes that a lot easier if we have to pull the trigger to request aerial fire suppression utilizing National Guard rotary wing assets. One of the things that we have to look at then, or we'll ask the county emergency manager to assist us with, is what bodies of water can they pull from? And those bodies of water then, what user rights are with those bodies of water? And then what do we need to adjudicate, or do you need to adjudicate at the local level to get permission to draw water for the Bambi buckets when the National Guard assets get there to assist with that aerial fire support and fire suppression. So we work with the Kansas Water Office to adjudicate those rights. That becomes critical when you have municipalities or jurisdictions or water districts that are pulling from those bodies of water for a public water supply. So that's one of those things that becomes increasingly critical for us to get that information and for you to provide that to your county emergency manager. In addition to that, he talked about being placed on standby. We have done that. We did that this last fire season, 2017, and I anticipate that we'll probably do more of that the end of 2017 into the 2018 wildfire. There are conference calls that the Interagency Wildfire Council have with National Weather Service representatives, the Fire Marshal's Office, the Forest Service, State Emergency Management. Those calls may be daily based upon the increased potential for fire weather. We've did a lot of those calls daily this past year, and probably will be like that with our outlook for 2018. But that gives us a chance to know what that fire modeling is looking like for that day or back-to-back extended period of days. And then we're able to work that right away with our state emergency support function partners, our internal KDEM staff to know what we may need to continue to monitor, and the Joint Operations Center, which is our conduit adjacent to our offices and our State Emergency Operations Center, and they reach out then to those additional National Guard assets that may be needed. So we're able to get that deployment time down some from that no notice notification to 6 hours when that helicopter is taking off to fly to the location of a fire.